Hello and welcome to our lecture on politics of code. Today we will focus on aspects of globality or universality versus local. That means the opposite, that you have things that are not global. And technology plays a huge role in supporting both aspects. And that becomes immediately clear if we look into representation of language in technology. So if you look at my name, how I usually write my name, this is not how my name is written in German. My first name that I write with an OE in German has an umlaut, O umlaut. It is Jörg. So it's only 4 letters, not 5. However, computers, when I started using them, were not able to display umlauts. And the reason behind that is the American Standard Code for Information Interchange, ASCII. So ASCII comes from a time when computer memory was really tiny. So people thought, we can represent numbers in a computer, that's obvious. I mean, it works with numbers basically, but how to represent letters properly? And there were competing ideas, but the most compelling seemed to be to use as little memory as possible to represent the alphabet. And so in 1960, after about 10 years of a process of developing it, the US Bureau for Standardization filed the standard for coding letters into 1 byte. So 1 byte of information seems very, very little today. But at the time when that was standardized in 1960s, even the most powerful computers would have much less memory available than even your circuitry that you do in physical computing with an Arduino today has. So it's really, it is understandable that people tried to be very economical with what they used. So in 1 byte you can have 2 to the 8, so it's 8 bits, so you have 2 to the 8 different different shapes, so to say, encoded, different letters, and that is 256. But if you think, well, in the English alphabet we have 26 letters, so that means 52 lower and uppercase letters, plus 10 numbers, and then all the punctuation, which is also about like 15 or 20 different characters. I mean, not only the standard punctuation, but maybe the percentage sign, parentheses, and then you need all the signs that are not visible but are really important to display text properly. For example, the space, the tab, but also the carriage return, which is the old name, CR, carriage return, comes from the typewriter for the new line. So you need a character for a new line, you need a character for backspace, and so on. So the 256 pretty quickly fill. And it's no wonder that people didn't think at that time much of other countries, because why would they? They were working in these big research institutes in America, probably all funded by the military. There was not much interest in looking outside your own small space. And I guess that computer scientists or electrical engineers, as there was no computer science yet at that time, were not so interested in the humanities in the first place. Well, and so I really had in the 1980s still to literally change my name, because I faced always the problem that people would not be able to spell it properly and then spell it in any kind of weird way. And of course, I'm not the only person here who faced that fate, because you all probably did. I might be disappointed that ASCII doesn't have any umlauts, or the sharp S, which is another special character in German. But there's many people, of course, who don't use the Latin alphabet in the first place. In Europe even, there is the people who use the Greek alphabet, the Cyrillic alphabet. the Georgian and Armenian alphabets. Then we have, of course, the Arabic world, where you have Arabic, which is even more complicated because you have the modern Arabic, and then you have the Quranic Arabic, which uses all the diacriticals. And I mean, you just can't drop that. And Hebrew, and then you go further east, and it becomes even more complicated. I mean, while you can even, I mean, you can still express Urdu and Hindi in an alphabetic way, so that you could even think of an ASCII-like representation of these languages. Certainly that won't work if you go to places where people use logographic alphabets, like in China, or in Japan, or in Korea. And the interesting thing is that all these three countries had ideas of letters, of formalizing writing, in particular of printing, long before the Europeans. But in the mid-20th century, of course, that didn't mean anything anymore. We are in the total peak of Western imperialism at that time, the Cold War. And of course, it means not only to not care what other people write, it's even a way of infiltrating, of building a moat that you have to embrace the oppressing culture. So, and people were very inventive, I mean, to get out of that. I mean, with the umlauts, I mean, there is even a German standard way, just add an E to the letter, like AE is A umlaut, OE is O umlaut, and UE is U umlaut. And the sharp S you don't really need, you can have two S's, and that's also fine. So people were dissatisfied, and you might have seen kind of these escapes that people use. So this says lead, and the way it is spelled is with numbers. So you could do that on a pocket calculator in the 1970s, and that's what school children, for example, did. But that's also what the cyber-minded people, the hackers, did. So they developed a substitute alphabet called LeetSpeak, from elite, and it had to do with the totally text-oriented bulletin board services. So that were like the use groups, or like today maybe text messages. That was communication platforms or forum where you could only exchange text. And to make it a bit more lively, I mean, you always wanted things like emojis, but they didn't exist. And also you wanted to show that you know more than other people, that you were elite. I mean, the elite is a state of administrative powers in these services. So, and that was abbreviated to be elite, to be part of the elite. And yeah, and you see this photo I made in a hackerspace in Vienna, kind of an anarchist environment, so to say, where everything is cyber. And of course you have the 1337 here too. Well, here's just an example that I made up. I mean, I just took this phony rhetoric from the NYU Abu Dhabi homepage and translated it into LeetSpeak, and you see how that works. So whatever can be expressed in numbers, you just exchange. I mean, not everything works really well. The N, for example, in new, you see it doesn't, but the E, you just take the 3. And so on, and it's quite fun, and you can totally obfuscate what you want to say. While this is just a plaything in a way, I mean, you can just write things in plain text, even in bulletin board services, so it doesn't really add much. There is a proper use for that. For example, here in the Arab-speaking world, where it is just not straightforward, in particular if you have a computer with an English keyboard, to switch. And if it is a keyboard and not on your phone, I mean, it's even more cumbersome because you have to remember on which of the keys which Arabic letter sits. And this is a thing that all of you, I guess, know. What people started, I think maybe 30 years ago or so, when the first, or at least 25 years ago, so when text messaging started to use what is often called Arabisi. So, which is exactly the same idea that you replace, but now you don't obfuscate, you just replace the characters that are hard to express in transliteration or don't make much sense. So, like for example, the ha or ha with the 7. So, and instead of the dot above for the ha, you add an apostrophe, for example. I have seen that a lot, and so I could remember some things like for example, kefal ha or meneha. I hope I don't make myself a total fool now pronouncing these things, but I mean, these are words that I've seen written, and so I just put that into the search and got randomly, I mean, pages of tweets that were spelled in Arabisi. So that's a very creative kind of workaround. If the technology forces you in some way, you might just as well escape. And that's also so fascinating to see that we have here kind of a subculture or counterculture against the Western mainstream that is kind of coloniality. So you try to subvert it, but it takes a second and people make money off it already and commodifies it. So what you see here is one of many marketing services that help marketeers to decipher, because I mean, of course you can't do natural language processing and topic detection or sentiment analysis. All these things fail in these weird alphabets. So there is kind of machine learning based translation services who would translate the Arabisi into proper Arabic, which I find such a strong indicator again that whenever there is a subculture, it takes like only a few days and people come up with a commodification for that. The first language, however, was not Arabic that was used in this lead speak like way, in this pseudo alphabet on the base of ASCII. The first was actually Cyrillic already in Soviet times. So in the Soviet Union, people faced, I mean, they had their own computers, but in particular people in science and in, I mean, let's say the spies, you know, they had to use computers with Latin alphabets. And whenever they wanted to write something in Cyrillic, that was difficult. And so they came up with a language, kind of a pseudo-alphabet to represent this informally, the Cyrillic. So it's not the scientific transliteration, because that would have then more letters. You know, like KH for H. So we have one letter, like in Arabic, where you have one letter. In Russian, you have also one letter, H, for this. You don't have two, like KH or Sha. There's one letter and not two or three even. And so you want a representation that kind of takes that into account, and this is what you see here. And the funny thing is that it was called Volapük. So Volapük, kind of the Volapük coding system, is not only the invention of this kind of workaround on the limitations of the ASCII system, it also makes fun of one of the very early artificial languages that people invented, which is the Volapük language. So there was this, I think, a priest in southwestern Germany around 1800, so 200 and something years ago, who said it is an injustice that we force other people in that time to learn French. We should instead have a language that is alien to everyone but much easier to learn. And it was not the first, so there is a predecessor to Volapük already. About 20 years earlier, a musician, an Italian musician, had invented the Zorimo language, which is basically using the notes of the 7 notes of the octave. And so you have only 7 different sounds and build all vocabulary out of it. I mean, his idea, I think, was more like singing than actually having a practical languages, but Here Volapük actually worked, and I mean it is still around, as you see. There is a Volapük Wikipedia still, and I guess that the Russians who came up with the Volapük coding system found that very funny. I mean, even the name is totally weird, that it has this German Ü in it, and it is really like a joke almost. But here you see that there is actual efforts to overcome this imperialist notion that everyone has to learn the same language to understand each other. So that is over 200 years ago that people already work on that. Universalism is the thing that we will look into a bit later. The most prominent of these artificial so-called Plansprachen, the German name, so it's a planned language, is Esperanto. So Esperanto was brought into existence by a Polish, I think, physician who had mercy with other people who had to learn Polish. It was also at the time when Poland was occupied by Russia. So in the late 19th century, Poland was occupied by Russia, and a part was also occupied by Germany. So the Polish state didn't really properly exist. And so this idea of having a language that is easy to learn and to understand, I think from a Polish perspective, had even kind of this liberating anti-imperialist idea behind it. It is a very liberating universalist idea behind it. And so Esperanto avoids everything that makes Polish one of the most difficult languages that I have encountered so far. You know, Polish has 8 cases and has all the genders and has a lot of very difficult to pronounce sounds. I mean, difficult for everyone outside Poland. A bit like French with all the nasals, but they have even more. And so all that is dropped, and you have a totally syllabic language. So Esperanto has just, so every syllable has a vowel, so you can't have vocal syllables like in Arabic, where you have you can express things without any vowels that are very hard for people who are used to that. It's more like Japanese, that really every syllable is made from a consonant and a vowel, and the words are formed in a very simple way. So all nouns end in an O. And all verbs, I think, end in an A, and so on. So it is super easy to learn. I mean, it doesn't have any cases, no genders, you know, no articles, and all the stuff that makes languages so hard to learn. And there was a big movement behind that. And now comes my personal connection to Esperanto. So what you see here, this Esperanto language newspaper was issued in the small town south of Munich where I grew up, called Gräfelfing. So no one has ever heard of Gräfelfing outside the Esperanto community. So what happened in Munich around 1900 was that there was a big Art Nouveau movement. So Art Nouveau started in France, and then was very strong in Germany as well. It is this idea to get rid of all that was bad of the 19th century, so to say, all the imperialism, all the heaviness, you know, all the carved wood furniture, all the gold in rooms, the thick carpets, the thick curtains and so on, have rather a very healthy lifestyle. People called, in Germany in particular, called this the reform lifestyle. And part of that was, for example, vegetarianism or veganism, being outdoors, starting exercises, and the whole kind of exercise culture comes from that, more or less. Going swimming every day and things like that come from that time. And Esperanto totally fit in this kind of idea of universal health and a unified humanity, very much education oriented and so on. And in the Munich was very wealthy at that time and had a large movement of Art Nouveau. And in the southwest of Munich there was whole colonies of kind of suburbs that were built in this Art Nouveau style, and Gräfelfing was basically not even existent before that time. It was like 5 houses or something like that, and a company called Terrain Society bought the land and started building these villas, just like here on Sadiyat. I mean, we have these constructions of villas. And they were so modern thinking that they said, well, everything here has to be in Esperanto. Everything has to become an Esperanto city. That was in 1912. And then 2 years later, World War I started, and all the ideas of a beautiful Esperanto city ended because the money was all lost, and after the war, after World War I, no one was interested in universalism anymore. People were totally nationalist. They were focused on the indignation that the lost war brought them, and that was not only in Germany, that was in many parts of Europe. Fascism was rising, and so there was no space for the thought of building a universal culture. Where universalism in language is really a strong driver. So you know probably that in 1923, when Turkey had its revolution, I mean Turkey, the Ottoman Empire ended with the First World War and then fell apart. I mean, the history of the United Arab Emirates is part of that, of course, and became kind of occupied mostly by Great Britain and France. For example, the Lebanon is part of what used to be Syria, or I mean, the Syrian part of the Ottoman Empire, and Lebanon was the French-occupied part, and Syria was the British-occupied part, and this is why it's 2 countries today. I hope I don't say anything ridiculous here, but this is how I learned it. And so Turkey, what is today Turkey, is kind of the remnant of the Ottoman Empire, fought for its independence in a way from the Sultan, and had a revolution. And part of this revolution under the revolutionary leader Atatürk, which means the father of the Turks, was to change the Arabic alphabet into the Latin alphabet. So the Turkish alphabet in use today is very similar in the pronunciation of the letters than the German alphabet, and that is no wonder. Turkey was in a way very closely allied with Germany and stayed so in the 1920s, and so Atatürk used the German pronunciation, like with the umlauts and so, to represent the Turkish language. This idea of westernizing and also shedding off imperialist oppression carries on to this day. So, for example, Kazakhstan for a long time had been occupied by Russia, and later been part of the Soviet Union, in the Soviet Union at least as an autonomous republic. So Kazakhstan became independent with the end of the Soviet Union, and one part of the Kazakh independence process is kind of finding its way as its own culture and its own economy. And I think Kazakhstan has a super interesting history over the last 30 years. It is in many ways also the history of a country that is very rich in natural resources. Kazakhstan has also a lot of oil, and is in many parts quite dry, so to say. So some similarities to the UAE. And the now retired Kazakh leader Nursultan Nazarbayev, in his efforts of modernization and investing the oil money into the economy, built a whole new city, the city of Astana, to replace the former capital city of Almaty, Alma-Ata in Russian. And one part of this modernization process is to adopt the Latin alphabet and get rid of the Cyrillic alphabet. So here's the interesting thing. For both countries, Turkey and Kazakhstan, the Latin alphabet is not the alphabet of an oppressor. And I think this is important to see here. The idea is to get rid of an alphabet that they found oppressive. And the Cyrillic alphabet, as the alphabet of the Russian imperialism and later Soviet imperialism, of course, is kind of seen as something that is not Kazakh. So instead of coming up with their own alphabet, I mean something that probably no one could read, the Kazakh cultural authorities here work on a representation of the Kazakh language in Latin letters with a few additions, I mean basically just accents. Apart from the alphabet, there is a more general aspect of digital technology that brings out the struggle between globality and locality. So these are just two random publications. The one, Electronic Superhighway, that was a seminal show in the Whitechapel Gallery 5 years ago, curated by Omar Khalif, who is now at the Sharjah Art Foundation. It was a really great exhibition of 50 years of digital art. So it's basically kind of a retrospective of everything that we would say is interactive media to that date. Very shiny, and of course has the name Electronic Superhighway for a reason that we will more thoroughly inspect now. And then at the same year, the so-called Globale at ZKM in Karlsruhe in Germany, also uniting the digital media. And you see in both kind of names, the Electronic Superhighway and Globale, kind of the claim that digital media in the arts make, which is a truly universal claim. So how does Electronic Superhighway come to be? What is a superhighway anyway? I mean, we look out the window here and see, for example, Sheikh Khalifa Highway or Sheikh Zayed Road in Dubai or so. There's these like 12-lane mega highways, and this is probably what people have in mind when they talk about the superhighway. So it's not just a highway, it is a highway that is without intersections like Autobahn in Germany or motorway in England, where people can drive really fast. And where there's a constant flow, I mean, no matter how much traffic, I mean, that is at least in people's fantasy. Of course, we know that that is not really the case because there's always congestions, and every highway that is built makes even more congestion. So this word, Electronic Superhighway, is really a very weird concept. So let's look how it came to be. So credited with the idea of the superhighway, of the electronic superhighway, is the Korean artist who, at the time when he claimed this word, lived in Germany, later also in the United States, Namjoon Paik. So Namjoon Paik is, I think, really one of the most interesting figures in interactive media and early electronic arts. So Namjoon Paik was part of the Fluxus movement. He was a disciple and co-worker with Joseph Beuys, and early on tried to reconcile kind of this globality, this McLuhanist kind of weird electronic virtual world in television in particular, with, for example, spirituality. So for a very clear reason, the television set is here juxtaposed to the Buddha. And he made a lot of art earlier in his career in particular, showing kind of the meditative aspect of the flimmering images of television sets. And so in 1993, Namjoon Paik was invited to install his art in the German pavilion in the Venice Biennial. So the Venice Biennial is a bit like the Olympic Games of art, it is like for 130 years or so, people have, so the Italian state invites all countries in the world to have a pavilion in Venice, initially in a small island called the Giardini, the gardens, and then spreading out all over the city of Venice, to represent the country with the best of art of the last 2 years, so to say. It is every 2 years, it's a biennial. And 1993 was a pivotal year for the Venice Biennial in many aspects. So, if I remember correctly, it was like the 100th anniversary, so that was one thing. And the second thing was, it was the first biennial that was truly after the end of the Cold War. So in 1993, for a brief moment, before, for example, the Yugoslav civil war really went off, the world seemed to have kind of gotten at peace in a way with each other. This Manichaean struggle of the West with the East came to rest, and Germany was reunited. So it was the first biennial in which there was only one German participation and not two, because the German Democratic Republic, the communist part of Germany, or the part that was occupied by the Soviet Union, had reunited with the West. And Nam June Paik was, of course, a very interesting choice, because he is, although very influential in Germany and had a long part of his career in Germany, he is a truly international artist, of course. I mean, he represents Korea, he represents Asian expatriatism in Europe, and then even kind of going further over the Atlantic and being kind of the third expatriate in the US. So Nam June Paik is a truly global figure, and in his very light and humorous way was perfect to balance the heaviness of the German reunification and the fear of people that in this pavilion that was built by Adolf Hitler's favorite artist and architect Albert Speer, that this fascist monument in the middle of the Giardini would now represent a newly rising like Fourth Reich Germany. So to understand how important Nam June Paik at that year was for the biennial and in particular for the German pavilion. And people really recognized it at that time. And that was even more so because the work of art that Nam June Paik contributed was called Marco Polo Electronic Superhighway Venice Ulaanbaatar. So that is something. So representing Germany at the Venice Biennial with a work that is kind of a recognition of Marco Polo's travel from Venice to the capital of Mongolia at his time. I mean, the Mongolian Empire stretched all the way from what is today still Mongolia over China, all the way to what is today Hungary. So it was probably the largest empire that ever existed, the empire of the Golden Horde. And in Ulaanbaatar sat the Khan, Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan. I mean, these names, I mean, the most fearful of all names. I mean, these warlords that had just torched Baghdad and created the largest mayhem ever to happen. So we are talking about like 800 years of this idea of bridging Europe with the East. So this is Marco Polo's time, around 1200, at the peak of Venice importance as being the gateway to the Islamic world, but then even along the Silk Road up to what is today East Asia. So, and Nam June Paik's honorable mention here for Marco Polo is also making, in a way, fun of his own struggle to make people aware of this idea of digital art as the superhighway, and in a way it is a friendly or satirical criticism of him claiming that he came up with the idea of the electronic superhighway 20 years earlier, and that Bill Clinton, the US president, had just bluntly plagiarized that idea by declaring the electronic superhighway the main goal of the Democratic program for his election campaign. So what is the electronic superhighway according to Nam June Paik? He says it is der Bau eines neuen Electronic Superhighway wird ein noch größeres Unternehmen als der Bau der Interstate Highways in den USA. Stellen Sie sich vor, wir verbinden New York und Los Angeles mit einem leistungsfähigen Breitband-Telekommunikationsnetz. So this is how he translated it. The building of the new electronic superhighway will be an even bigger enterprise than building the interstate highways in the New Deal time in the 1930s in the US. Suppose we connect New York and Los Angeles with multi-layer of broadband communication networks such as domestic satellites, waveguides, bunches of coaxial cables, and later the fiber optic laser beam. So his vision is indeed exactly building backbones for a thing that was not yet there, which would be the internet 20 years later. And so electronic superhighway is this Promethean vision of connecting the whole world with a highway-like structure by the artist Nam June Paik. Well, what is a highway and what does it do? So this quote is from the Swiss author Max Frisch's most famous novel, Homo Faber. So the highway, that's the American way of life. What America has to offer: comfort, the best gadgets in the world, ready for use. Wherever they go, everything is turned into a highway, with the world as a wall of billboards on either side. And if you drive around the Emirates, you see how much this is true. I mean, instead of having a free line of sight, we have these tarp walls everywhere with advertising on it, and only have these highways that connect the points as if nothing would have been ever sitting in between. So the highway is an illustration of gigantic waste of land. I mean, the on and off ramps of highway are bigger than most small villages or towns. You need enormous curves that the cars can drive fast, even if they leave the highway. And since nothing else is there, and because they're totally monotonous, you need advertising. I mean, because nothing else is to see on the highway. So, and what also happens is that the highway homogenizes the once varied neighborhoods. So what happens here is that we can, with the highway as being this metaphor of domestic imperialism, of smoothing, of planing the whole country into a big suburban periphery, take that into digital media and think of how much of that is actually happening with the internet as well. And if you think of pre-digital times, I mean, what I said about the ASCII code, I mean, in a way, the so-called Dvorak keyboard layout that we all use, that is the keyboard layout with the QWERTY, is in the heart of this homogenization. It is all that is kind of expressing this contempt for other cultures, because every other language is just seen as a variation of English. Every other alphabet is just, for example, Hebrew or Arabic are just English in the reverse. Russian has just different letters, but it is basically the same. And only if you face languages that are entirely different, like Chinese, with a logographic alphabet, you have to face that this metaphor only carries so far before you have to admit that it is actually kind of a colonial mentality that comes through it. And if you look at this beautiful Chinese typewriter that at least has about 2,000 characters, the most used 2,000 characters on work here, the other like 30,000 characters are in a filing cabinet behind the typist. You see that there was actually effort taken to escape this monotony, to make it work. However, for a long time, and in particular when the internet really took off, that seemed to be a lost cause. And indeed, I mean, although you might think now it is easy to publish languages and you find people who speak your language, it is more the other way around, that people tend to use the language that is most commonly spoken, which is, of course, English and Chinese, and to some extent then other very common languages. So in Wikipedia, for example, 80% of all articles are from in the English Wikipedia and in the German Wikipedia. And only 20% of Wikipedia is all of the rest. And so 75 of the web's top level domains come from .com or .org, which are basically entirely in English. And so at the Wikimedia Foundation, people try to work against that. For example, there is a project running Lingua Libre that is a project funded by Wikimedia Foundation to record languages that are not written. So there is a lot of languages that had not been written down ever. Still, there is a few people speaking these languages, and the Wikimedia Foundation is one of the cultural bodies trying to preserve these languages, because everyone is aware that these languages might just fade away very soon. So in a way, Neil Stephenson is one of the more famous cyberpunk authors. In his novel Cryptonomicon, which is also about like 1993 or 1994, already summarized that when there is this kind of totally awkward, kind of a bit repelling Finnish humanities scholar in argument with the hero of the book, who is a nerd, who is kind of this programming bro, and the Finnish philosopher, he totally blows the main character's mind by stating this thing. I mean, how many slums will we bulldoze to build the information superhighway? How many on-ramps will there be to connect the world's ghettos to the information superhighway? That is, I think, the key question. So how much diversity do we actually allow on the internet? And allowing means not in legal terms. That is not a problem that is done forcefully. It is a dynamic that comes ideologically. And on the other hand, how much do we actually do to include those left behind? And I think this is really, one of the key questions to discuss. And this marginalization of most of the world and forcing them kind of to accept the terms of technology is really one of the most difficult, I think, problems that you all will have to face if you work in interactive media. So this is a really critical part and makes me sound very much in favor of ethno-nationalism. And I promise you I'm not. I'm very much in favor of universalism. I really enjoy that we can communicate in English. I wouldn't be here, and none of you probably would be, if we wouldn't have this lingua franca, this language that we all share. And I actually don't think that it makes sense to come up with artificial languages like Esperanto or their likes. Because what's so much better about that? Just because some people have an advantage because they are born speaking English, while others have to have that as their second or third language, well, that is, of course, not so great, but it is better than everyone being in the disadvantaged position. I don't think that we need to go back to kind of artificial languages that are actually dead. And therefore, I'm very grateful that actually the world changes and has started changing for almost immediately after things became clear that they would be so kind of exclusive. So very shortly after the ASCII code was finalized, as early as in the mid-1960s, people in America in particular started to realize that that was incredibly limiting and discriminating. And people from the tech world took that into their hands and said, we can't go on like that. We have to come up with something better, even if technology will take time to actually provide enough calculation and storage capabilities. And also, of course, it's capitalism driving that, because namely Xerox, the inventor of the copying machine, but also other digital devices, and Apple in the 1980s, they realized that their biggest market might actually be the global market, and so limiting themselves to just one alphabet and just one lingual expression would of course diminish their market possibilities. And so Xerox and Apple in 1980 started an initiative called Unicode, and in 1988 most of the big tech industry had joined, like Adobe, Microsoft, IBM. And they issued the proposal for a new standard that would then be standardized soon after, called Unicode, that would use 2 bytes instead of 1 byte. And 2 bytes it doesn't seem like much more actually, but it doesn't just double the number of characters. So while you can represent in 1 byte 2 to the 8, that's 256 characters, I mean in 2 bytes you can express 2 to the 16, and that is way more than 1 million characters. And there is not 1 million characters in use in all the languages in the world currently known. So actually that should work. And let's just have a look how that is. So Unicode, so you see here the Unicode homepage. I mean, they really advertise their diversity. And if you dig into the website, which I strongly encourage, it's really interesting how the Unicode system of the 2 byte notation is encoded. So you see all the alphabets that you could think of. I mean, starting with, I mean, not only alphabets that are still in use, but seeing the Glagolitic or Staroslaviatsky alphabet, which is this old Church Slavic, or the Georgian alphabets, for example, that I mentioned, were always missing. But also Armenian, and then you go to South Asian and see the richness of it. So all the languages, the alphabets in South Asia. And the interesting thing is it is also the languages that are long lost, like linear A and B from Crete. From the Minoan culture, or the hieroglyphs or cuneiforms, and here, I mean, the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Korean scripts, of course, as well. And if you look, for example, into the table of Arabic, so you see how the logic goes. So each character has a 4 digits in hexadecimal and 5 digits in decimal notation. So the hexadecimal is to be preferred, because if you write code, in particular HTML, I mean, that's just shorter, you know, and it saves space. So use the hexadecimal. So if you look at the characters, I mean, you see the richness. I mean, it's not only the standard characters here, like the Nun For example, it's also the diacritical, it's all the specialities of Persian, and so on. So finally, we have a method that would allow us to express languages in their proper alphabet. And I think this self-confidence is really something that we can use to reconcile this struggle between global domination and local identity. Thankfully, Alexandra contributed this link that is about the initiative to bring Urdu in a better way into the digital realm. It's a very nice story. I mean, generally, if you look at the formation of the Indian states, I mean, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, after their independence in 1947, it is a worthwhile reading history of language. Because the first Prime Minister of India, Nehru, I mean, he comes from Kashmir, and as I read at least, hardly was fluent in Hindi. And so for him, it was relatable that just having Hindi as the Indian national language would probably not really do justice to what would become these new democracies, and this is the struggle that was going on following from 1947 through the 1960s to this day. How to reconcile using the language of the colonial oppressor as your national language. I think this is a very difficult discussion. And I find it truly inspiring and interesting to follow. There's a lot of things for me to learn in that, and I think that is an example to be taken by many other countries. It is the example of a whole people accepting universalism and recognizing the difficulties in that. That is at least my interpretation, not claiming any real knowledge in that. In the readings, I point you to another approach here that is a very digital, post-internet approach. That is NASA's project ALP. And the interesting thing that NASA faced in his project was, I mean, even if you have the surface of a programming language in another language, the underlying parts are still all English. And so he tried to build from the scratch, I mean, really starting with the assembly code, something that isn't. I think it is an interesting work of art, and there's others, as I pointed out. So the last part of the lecture, we will move even further away now from languages and culture to another part of globalism and universal, so to say, claim of digital technology. So that is best summarized by Marshall McLuhan's quote that in our electric world there are no remote places anymore. What does that mean? So not being active online doesn't mean that the internet doesn't intrude into your life. Biometric data on the ID cards, for example, having to have a mobile phone, so to say, electronic tax declarations, video surveillance, marketing. So there is so many things that have direct impact into people where there is no opt-out. And this is also a part of globalizing digital technology effects. One of that is the struggle of local societies with global organizations. For example, Wikipedia over many years, I mean now it's actually 2 decades, refuses to accept, for example, German or other European legislation. So for example, Germany has a very strong anti-defamation law. So if you write things that are lies about another person, this person can require takedown. There is no free speech logic to cover telling lies in Germany. And Wikipedia just refuses to comply to that. So a person says, well, there is lies about, in that case, even my dead son. So on Wikipedia, please remove that. And of course, you could say, well, yeah, just edit it out. And in the first step, the mother, I think, of her son, she edited the lies out. However, they were still in the history, so you could still see it all if you just click one way back. And Wikipedia refused to edit the history. And as a result, a German court ruled a takedown notice that would force Wikipedia to stop their service in Germany. And Wikipedia then changed their policy. They stopped using the .national domains like .de, .ae, .uk, whatever, and switched to a US-based domain service, which is .org. And since that time, you can only reach Wikipedia by putting in, for example, it.wikipedia.org for the Italian Wikipedia, or ar.wikipedia.org for the Arabic Wikipedia. That is the result, to evade the national rules. So what is going on here? There is a society that has formulated their rules and has that in their laws and court rulings. And then there is an organization, a global organization, an American organization actually, that just says, well, that is not binding to us because only American law is applicable to us. And this is a different form of what is going on in terms of global versus local. We face the same with Google, with Facebook, with Amazon to some extent. The struggle of local legislators to kind of tame these global giants that just refuse to obey local laws. But Google and Facebook are more vulnerable because they need advertising money, so you can actually cut them where it really hurts them. Wikipedia doesn't need advertising money, they are independent from that. So they are really independent from any kind of local influences in that respect. And then, of course, we have the other side of that. This is this reaction that comes. This is literally shutting down the internet to shut up whom you don't want to hear. So this is the other extreme. So the one is global companies, global organizations not caring what people locally think. The other is people locally in power saying, well, they can say these things anywhere, but not here. We just cut them off. And there is really a disconcerting amount of internet outages every day, actually, all over the world. And it is not only in totally authoritarian dictatorships, it is not only countries knowledgeable for that, it is literally happening almost everywhere in the world that some parts of the internet gets filtered, and very few countries actually don't do that. The United Nations started becoming aware of that more than 10 years ago. So the report of the special rapporteur on the internet to the General Assembly says in its summary how concerned the United Nations are about ongoing local censorship of global news content, and finally declares it a human right to have proper access to sources that people choose to access. So this is the other side. So we have now a universal body, a transnational body, the United Nations, getting on the scene and trying to negotiate a compromise between the sometimes justified, often not justified local actions against the internet and the global character of this medium. Well, a lot of what I said in a way has to do with feelings. And this feeling that we have to have something that is our own, for example, our language, that doesn't get tainted, that we have sovereignty over, has of course to do with the idea of identity. So identity is a rather recent concept in human thinking. And I think it started as a Western concept, actually, in about 300 years ago. It has a super interesting history of mind behind that and philosophy, and was, I mean, brought totally to people's mind at the end of the 18th century, so around the time of the French Revolution, by a Swiss medical scholar, Johannes Hofer, by inventing a new illness. So a new illness, a new disease that he called nostalgia. So nostalgia, so that means that is the pain of not being at home. And that is all that is the struggle that we face here. We have this pain of losing our identity, and we have, on the other hand, I at least do, the hope of salvation in a global society, in a universal society of people living peacefully together. So this is a truly kind of dialectic situation. Everyone feels the pain of being from somewhere and having identity that is, of course, not only tied to language. There is a lot of other identities, as you all know: gender, the racial appearance, religion, and many others. So identity is a very complex question. And against that, we have the hope of becoming one big global society. And in a way, I think we are in the beginning of this struggle of global versus local. So we had a very global mindset in the 1990s. The claims were really imperialistic sometimes. I mean, like conquering the whole world with the internet. And then we have the backlash of the last 20 or so years of ethno-nationalism, of taking back control. And what we don't see really is that, in a way, we have to find our way to see that there is a new culture emerging that is driven by digital technology. And so I love this quote by Bruce Sterling, so that it is not about making people speak Latin again. I mean, you could say also Esperanto or whatever, that language, just that everyone has the same. It is about acknowledging that there is vernacular culture. And vernacular culture is the culture of people writing in their own language. But that doesn't mean in the language of their nation. That means in the language that they think. So that might be even smaller. A vernacular started to become a thing in Europe, for example, in the 13th century with the authors like Dante Alighieri in Italy, or Chaucer in England, or Walter in Germany, to write in a language that actually was not seen as one before. Like in Italian instead of Latin, in English instead of Latin, or in German instead of Latin. And this turn towards the vernacular created a whole new field for art, which is the art of small cultures instead of the universal Catholic art that was there before. And although I don't know much about that, I think similar things happen in other places in the world. For example, in China, that there is a struggle between kind of unifying the whole country under one language, under one culture, versus accepting that there is a lot of small vernaculars going on. And the vernacular is not only language. There is a lot of cultural vernacular, subculture also, that needs to be brought out to the open and acknowledged to become its own thing.